Okay, this lesson is on the privileges, limitations, and requirements of a private pilot. This class is about private pilots, and this will fall into sort of the pilots and people category of private pilot knowledge. It's not really much about aircraft or airports or airspace, so this will fall into that category there. This lesson will introduce you to what it takes to become a private pilot, like what's the requirements for that. It'll talk about what they can do, what their limitations are. So those are privileges, what they can do. Limitations is what they can't do. You're going to learn about some of their responsibilities as what we call a pilot in command or a PIC. So that's going to be a bit of what we learned about today. So let's get to it. Make sure you have your note packets. If anything is in your note packets as we go, then you need to fill those out. The first thing is about the FAA. The FAA is the Federal Aviation Administration. Um, they're responsible for the safety of civil aviation. Now, there's military aviation and civil aviation. So, military aviation is, Army, Navy, Air Force and Marines, and the Coast Guard, and the everything else in aviation is kind of civil aviation. A lot of space travel and things like that falls in both civil and military both. So it just depends on kind of who you're working for if you're doing space stuff. But basically, they manage the airspace. They say that they own all the airspace in the United States. And they are federal. They operate at the national level. They're federal. They operate at the national level. So you have federal government, state government, local government. States like the state of Utah, federals over all 50 states and our territories, and then local governments like the county government, like Summit County, or the city government like Park City. So we're going to talk a lot about some laws. Most of the laws we are going to talk about exist in one of two parts. One is 14 CFR Part 61. The other is 14 CFR Part 91. CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations, and we're going to kind of break those down a little bit, and we'll talk about what those parts are later in a lesson about the FAR specifically. I think it's lesson 4 or 5 coming up. Part 61 of the federal laws for aviation talk about how pilots get certified or licensed. For example, we have this one law called Part 61-103. And you should know that the federal aviation regulations are divided into parts. Part 61 deals with the certification of pilots. Any certification you wish to have is in there. If you want to be a commercial pilot, an airline transport pilot, glider pilot, etc., they are all in there. And each part will have subparts that are numbered. For example, this is part 61. That's like a chapter in the book of regulations. And 103 is like a subchapter or a page of that chapter. So it's part 61, and then the law is 103. And they're called eligibility requirements for private pilots. So that's what we're talking about now. Like, what does it take to become a private pilot? So in the last note page of your notes, we have a figure 1, and it has in here eligibility requirements. For example, you must be at least 17 years of age if you're going to become a private pilot. Now, you can solo before that, and we'll talk about that later. You got to be able to read, write, and understand the English language. You have to receive a logbook endorsement from an instructor who conducted the training for the aeronautical knowledge. That'll be me. I'm conducting your training on aeronautical knowledge. We're not doing flight training, just the knowledge part. So you'll need to get that endorsement from me. And you have to certify that the person is prepared for the required knowledge test. Then you have to pass a knowledge test. That's a written test. You have to receive flight training and an endorsement from that flight training who conducted it. And then you have to meet a bunch of experience requirements of this part, which is down in 61-107. And you have to pass practical tests on those things in this part. And we'll talk about those in a little bit as well. So you have to so something you should write in your notes for 61-103 is 17 years of age, be able to read, write, and speak and understand the English language, receive a logbook endorsement from an instructor who conducted the training on aeronautical knowledge or ground school, In this case, that'll be me. Pass the required knowledge test on aeronautical knowledge, which is the written test. Receive flight training from a logbook endorsement from an authorized instructor, and meet the aeronautical requirements of Part 61. And you got to pass a practical test on the areas of operation listed in 61.107 of this part. And you might want to pause that to write all that down. You can paraphrase it a little bit so that you know what it says, but those are the things you need to know, A through G there. All right, now that you have that written down, let's talk about what you have to know in ground school specifically. Now, this is a different law. This is 61.105. See how it went up 1 or 2 numbers? There's no even numbers in here. I'm not entirely sure why, if they left it so they could put laws in later. I really don't know that answer. But what matters is the name of this law, 61.105, and this is aeronautical knowledge. This is the stuff we have to cover in ground school. Alrighty, so let's go over some of those things there. And all this is just pulled from the regulations. There is also figure 2 in your notes. That's the actual law, though. So if you want it paraphrased in your notes, you might want to look at that as well. Sorry, I guess we don't have that. I didn't make you write those things down in your notes. That's okay. So flight proficiency. So in your notes about flight proficiency, here's some things you need to be able to do. You need to be able to do pre-flight preparation and procedures. Now, this is 61.107. This is just the next law in the steps there. But you have to know how to pre-flight prep. Pre-flight prep is things like knowing how to calculate takeoff and landing distances, knowing how to use charts, knowing how to actually pre-flight the aircraft. Pre-flighting the aircraft is when you look at the airplane before you go, and you check all the systems, and check the frame, and check the tires, and check the oil, and you just check everything on the aircraft before you go. Let's see what else we have. What's B? Let's see here. Let's try that there. Airport operations. So how do we operate on airports? Takeoffs and landings. Performance maneuvers like steep turns. Ground reference maneuvers. These are maneuvers called turns around a point and S-turns. Navigation. So pause and write those down. And we're going to continue the list with slow flight and stalls. And we'll talk more about what slow flight and stalls are in class. But there are 2 kind of maneuvers that you have to be able to do. In almost every rating I've done, we've done a little bit of slow flight, it seems like. And definitely in stalls and everything as well. Your instrument rating, commercial rating, you'll still do stalls. Emergency procedures. What do you do in case of an emergency? Flying at night. Instrument maneuvers. And post-flight. What do you do after you're done flying? What do you do after you're done flying? All right, experience. Like, what are some things you have to go out and do in the airplane? Okay, you said I have to get flight training. We just talked about that. Like, well, you have to be proficient at that. Well, how many hours of this stuff? Can I go out and do it once and say, okay, that's good, and move on? You know, it depends. It depends on what the law says. So the aeronautical experience I pulled from 14 CFR 109. And this is aeronautical experience. And this breaks it down. Now, what I want you to look at is, if you ever look at this law, look at how it says for an airplane single engine land rating. So this is a long law. Look at all this stuff, but not all of it applies to you. It depends on what kind of aircraft you're flying. Airplane single engine land, that'll be us. 1 engine, landing on the land. And this is for private pilots. So this will be the stuff you have to do for that. And then the second it changes to another letter, so this is subpart B, airplane multi-engine rating. So we're not doing multi-engine or talking about it very much in this class, so that won't be us. Also in here, helicopter. Maybe you're like, I'm more interested in helicopters than this airplane stuff. Well, this is the helicopter stuff. Gyroplane, that's a type of like push-pull kind of aircraft, is in there. Powered lift rating is in there. Glider category, so a bunch of different stuff. We're going to focus on part A here. We're going to focus on part A and what it takes to do that. So let's write some stuff down in our notes about that. You need 40 hours of flight time. Now, there is a caveat to that. Some schools can do it in 35, and we will talk about that later in this lesson. But you need 20 hours of flight training with an instructor. We call this dual instruction time. You need 10 hours of solo time. You need cross-country which are flights greater than 50 miles. You need to do those 3 hours of those with an instructor. I don't know why that has a bullet point. There we go. And we have, let's see, let's get back to our slide here. 5 hours of solo time. Okay, so you need to have 5 hours of solo cross-country time and 3 hours with an instructor. So that's just 8 hours of cross-country time you're required to have there. You have to have one solo of at least 150 miles with landings at 3 airports. Okay, so that means that one of your solo cross-country flights needs to be 150 miles, and that with landings at 3 airports. So that's what we call your long cross-country. Keep in mind, a normal cross-country is just 50 miles. This has to be 150 miles total. I think one leg has to be 100 miles by itself. Like you have to have this nice long leg that you fly, just to show that you know how to do some navigation. There's also some night flying requirements. You have to have 3 hours with an instructor with 10 takeoffs and landings. And you have to have 3 hours of what we call instrument time. Now, we can log time in the simulators in class. So if you're taking the simulator lab particularly, we'll log definitely your 3 hours of instrument time. We might get to 3 hours of instrument time in class, in private pilot class. It's kind of tricky because there's only specific things that you can do, and you have to be flying solely reference to instruments. But we can do it, but we just got to figure out how we're going to do that. But you can apply the instrument time that you do log in class in school with our certified simulators towards that instrument time. And you have to have 3 takeoffs and landings at an airport with a control tower. Let me fix that one real quick. There we go. Sorry about that, but I want to make sure that was right. All right, so this next part's actually in your notes, but this is the typical path of flight training and experience from zero to the airlines. This is the typical flight path. Now, I want to say this is not for military pilots. This is for some cargo pilots as well as some airline pilots. But typically, if you're like, well, what order, what ratings are there? I've heard of an instrument rating or like a commercial rating. Like, why can't I just go do a commercial rating? Things like that. So I'm going to kind of go over that. Now, this is in your notes. You don't have to write this down. And we'll talk more about this in class. But you have student pilot. Once you become a student pilot, then you can get your private pilot's license. You can then get your instrument rating. Then you can go get your commercial rating. You have to have a private in order to get a commercial. But believe it or not, you don't have to have an instrument rating to get a commercial. It just helps that you got to build this time anyway, so why not go get a rating while you're doing it? And then some people go on to get their multi-engine rating. Some people don't. But that's about 12 more hours if you want to learn to fly multi-engine airplanes. And there's a lot to this that I'm not covering right now. Like, for example, you could get your private in a multi-engine plane, but then you could only fly multi-engine. You couldn't fly single engine. And you'd have to go back and do a single engine add-on. This is called a multi-engine add-on. And then some people go on to become a CFI because they need to get their ATP in order to get hired by the airlines. And that's 1,500 hours if you didn't go through a college program. Some college programs allow you to do it in 1,000. And so all the time you fly as a flight instructor counts towards your time, towards getting your ATP done. So you might want to keep that in mind as well, that you're going to have to do something between, because right about here at commercial rating, you have about 250 hours, and you need to get to that 1,500 if you're going to go to the airlines. In class, we'll watch this video on how to become an Air Force pilot. For some reason right now, it is not letting me show that video. Alrighty, we'll just keep on rolling, but we'll watch that video in class. Then let's talk about flight schools a little bit. Now, there's 2 types of schools. There's also 142 schools, which we're not going to talk about. But most schools that private pilots run into are Part 61 versus Part 141. Part 141s are schools that are heavily regulated by the FAA, and we'll talk more about that in class. But basically, they submit what's called a TCO, or training course outline. It's then approved by the FAA. Then they get inspected regularly. They have to keep records. They have to have a hierarchy of a chief pilots and assistant chief pilots and stage check instructors. and they have to have every place a student is going to learn listed in that TCO, like classrooms and what sizes they are, what they can and can't do, and it's really regulated and organized in a heavy fashion. And but in exchange for that, 141 schools can typically do ratings in a little bit less time, or in case of commercial license, a lot less time. So let's take a look at that really quickly. Part 61 has a 40-hour private versus a 141 has a 35-hour private. So you save about 5 hours, which is, maybe around $1,000 or $1,200 depending on how much the flight school is charging. 250-hour commercial in a Part 61 school versus a 190-hour commercial in a Part 141 school. That's 60 hours. Now at 200 an hour, that's a huge saving right there. So you can save a lot of money going to get your commercial rating. So a lot of people like to go to 141 to save money down here in the commercial rating. There's a game to this where you don't have to necessarily go to do your private at 141 in order to do the instrument and commercial, but a lot of 141 schools require you to take their instrument and commercial together. It really just depends on how their TCO, their training course outline, was approved and how it's all put together, and their rules, and sometimes they give preference to students who did do their privates there. So, it's just, you just got to make some tough decisions when it comes to making flight training decisions. And that's the end of part 1 of our notes. We're going to go ahead right into part 2, and we're going to talk about pilot and command. We're going to talk about pilot and command. So pilot and command is a person who has the final authority and responsibility for the operation and safety of flights. Be sure to write that down. They've been designated as a pilot in command before or during the flight, and they hold the appropriate category, class, and type rating if appropriate for the conduct of the flight. So those are things that should be in your notes. Make sure you pause and write those down. Now let's talk about what they can and can't do as private pilots, as pilot in command of private pilot airplanes. We're using 61.113 for this. We're going to do an activity in class using that, so you might want to look up 61.113 before class. So let's take these scenarios. We're going to take these scenarios and we're going to use these in class as well. We're going to talk about, well, what can you and can't do. So you might want to look at 61.113. But here's a little hint. Number 1, privileges. You can fly aircraft based on your license. So that's a good privilege, right? You can go out and fly airplanes. But the one thing that's different between that and a student pilot, because a student pilot could solo technically and fly solo. They could fly airplanes. But you can carry passengers as a private pilot in 113. You can carry people in your plane. You don't have to be solo by yourself, the sole occupant of the plane. You can also tow gliders as a private pilot. So if you become part of a glider club, you could tow gliders for them. And you can help with search and rescue. We'll talk more about that in class. And you can sell aircraft with the appropriate amount of hours. And we're going to talk about what that appropriate amount of hours is in class. Now here's some limitations. Number 1, you cannot be paid directly, meaning you can't say, yeah, I'll fly it down to, St. George or wherever. Just pay my cost of the plane. Plus, I'm going to throw in, maybe you guys pay me $200 each or something like that. No, you can't do that. You cannot carry cargo for hire. We're going to explain what that means in a little bit. But basically, if somebody says, hey, I know you're flying out to Wendover this weekend, could you take this box of car parts out to the Bonneville Salt Flats for me, and I'll pay you $500 because there's a car out there waiting for them. And you can't do that. You must pay your prorata share of all expenses for a flight. Prorata means your share, like your equal share. So if you had, let's say a flight cost $800 total, you have to pay at least $200 if there's 4 of you in the plane, because 800 divided by 4 is 200 each. You can pay more than that. You could pay 500 and everybody else pay 300 or whatever you want to work out. But you can't pay less than anybody else in that plane for that. Now, in order to be a private pilot, you have to stay current, and we have to have some recency requirements. So let's talk about what those are. So you get your license, and in order to keep flying legally after you get your license, you must demonstrate recency of experience and proficiency as a pilot. That's right in the regulations. And one of the ways we do this is with a flight review. This is from FAR 6156. And once every 2 years, we call it a biannual flight review because it's once every 2 years. You have to get what's called a BFR or a biannual flight review, and it's good for 24 calendar months. By the way, we're going to talk about calendar months a lot in aviation, but calendar months are when you don't count it day to day. So let's say it's the let's say it's the 18th of October, 2023. Okay. If you got your BFR on the 18th of October in 2023, it is good for 24 calendar months, which means it's good for October to October of 2025, but to the last day of the month. It's good for the entire month of October. So I always say get your biannual flight review the first few days of a month, because then you technically get like an extra month onto it, meaning that if you got it like the 1st of October, it's actually good to the 31st of October 2 years later, because it's good for the whole month of October, because it's counting calendar months, it's not counting days. So try to learn that. A lot of regulations talk about calendar months, not 2 years from the exact date kind of thing. So for example, you got a flight review on the 17th of March. When's your next BFR due? Think about that. We'll talk about that in class. You cover many things, and it's at the discretion of the flight instructor giving the review. Typically, I look at what you do with your flying. Do you mostly fly for fun? Then we'll go out and do some maneuvers, make sure you're being safe. Do you fly point A to point B a lot, like you travel for business using your own plane? Well, then I would say, okay, we're going to go out and do some navigation and do some diversions and loss procedures and things like that, because you could get, those are things that you might need to be, brush up on and whatever. So typically it's at the discretion of the flight instructor. But you must fly to the proficiency of your license. So if you're a private pilot, you have to fly to private pilot standards. It's a minimum of 1 hour of ground and 1 hour of flight time. So you have to spend an hour on the ground with the instructor, and you have to have a minimum of 1 hour of flight time. And you get an endorsement at the end. They endorse your logbook saying you're good for another 24 calendar months. And you cannot be pilot in command of any aircraft without this. You cannot be pilot in command without that. You basically are grounded until that's done. You can't do that. You can't fly solo. You can't fly with people, whatever. You have to fly with an instructor, or you can fly in a plane, but somebody else has to be pilot in command until that's done. All right, recent flight experience. Now this is different. That was currency. This is currency, and this is recency. So in order to carry passengers, you have to accomplish the following every 90 days. So if you're just flying solo, you don't have to do this every 90 days. It could have been 6 months, as long as you've got your current BFR, your biannual flight review. You can go fly kind of whenever you want within that 24 months. You don't have to have done any takeoffs and landings. But in order to carry passengers, so you're going to take your mom or dad or friend for a flight, you have to accomplish the following every 90 days. At least 3 takeoffs and landings in order to carry passengers in the preceding 90 days. In the same category, so if you're flying an airplane, it has to be an airplane. If you happen to have done 3 takeoffs and landings in a glider, and now you're going to go fly an airplane because maybe you have both licenses, that doesn't count. You have to do these, and they have to have been, the 3 takeoffs and landings have to have been in an airplane. And if carrying passengers at night, then at least 3 takeoffs and landings at night in the preceding 90 days. So what else does a pilot in command, make sure you write that, pause and write all those down. So what else does a pilot in command need to know? All kinds of little typos in my slides there. What else does a pilot in command need to know? Well, here's some things they're responsible for. Being familiar with all available information concerning that flight. That's weather, runways, everything. Fuel required for their flight. They have to know kind of what their fuel is going to, calculations are required for their flight. So how do you calculate those? You have to know the inspections are required for their aircraft, and if it's in what we call airworthy condition, and knowing which aircraft documents must be in the aircraft to fly legally. And how to report an accident or incident. So first thing we're going to cover in that list is 91-103. That's number 1. It's called Preflight Action. And each pilot in command shall, before beginning a flight, become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. This includes runway links at airports of intended use, takeoff and landing distance data, weather from approved sources, airspace and notices about airspace changes. So those are things that you have to know before you become airborne as pilot in command, or even before you really start the engine, before you start taxiing to take with the intent to take off. You need to have all these things done before you begin your flight. Then we have fuel requirements. No person may begin a flight in VFR conditions. VFR conditions, by definition, are better than 3 statute miles of visibility. So you have to have 3 miles of visibility in order to be considered VFR. Private pilots without an instrument rating are considered VFR pilots. So if you just got your private pilot's license and don't have an instrument rating, or you've had it for years and don't have an instrument rating, you're considered a VFR pilot. You're flying in VFR conditions, better than 3 miles visibility in most cases. Now, you may not begin a flight in VFR conditions unless, considering wind and forecast weather conditions, there is enough fuel to fly the first point of intended landing and assuming normal cruise speed. During the day, you have to be able to fly for 30 minutes past where you're going. So let's say you're flying from here to Denver and you have enough fuel to get to Denver. Then you have to calculate 30 minutes more. We don't do miles per gallon in airplanes because we have headwinds and tailwinds and all kinds of different things. So we do it based on time. We do gallons per hour. And so let's say it's going to take you 4 hours or 3.5 hours to fly to Denver. Okay, then you need to have 4 hours of fuel on board because it takes you 3.5 hours to fly there. Then you need to have 30 extra minutes past that by law. That's the minimum. You can have more than that if you want, but that's the minimum that you're supposed to have. And then at night, you need to fly after that for at least 45 minutes. So if you're flying at night or you start in the day, but flying at any point during the night, you're going to be landing at night. So you get there, you have to have 45 extra minutes. That's because it's hard to see stuff at night sometimes. All right, aircraft inspections. I like to remember using AV8, and it's AAV18. AV8, aircraft inspections. Here they go, ready. Number 1, airworthiness directives. All your ADs have to be done. We'll talk about those in class. Annual inspection has to be done every 12 calendar months. That's basically when they look at all kinds of different engine and control systems and all kinds of different things. VOR has to be every 30 days. We'll talk about that in class because that's technically not for every flight. You have to have a 100-hour inspection. Now, not every plane needs a 100-hour inspection, so we're going to talk about that in class. Altimeter, pitot-static system. We haven't talked about these systems yet, but we're going to talk about them when we get to the aircraft section of this course, and that's every 24 calendar months. Transponders every 24 calendar months as well. We're going to talk about what a transponder is when we get to airspace. And an ELT, we'll talk a little bit about that in class as well, but that's every 12 calendar months. So these inspections have to be done before you fly. So you should be able to look at the maintenance log for an airplane before you fly, or maybe you own the airplane so you know when these things are done. But if you're renting an airplane from a flight school or whatever, you need to check these things before you go fly. It is easy to overfly, particularly this 100-hour inspection, and we'll talk about that in class. I'm not going to waste the time right now with it. All right, aircraft documents. I like to remember it with ARO. We used to have a second R in here, but they got rid of the requirement for that. It was called a radio license. Now we have an ARO with one R, so RO, I guess. So we have airworthiness. Okay. We have registration. I'll change one thing here I don't like. We have airworthiness. We have registration certificate. So it's got to be registered with usually the state or something like that. And basically it's a federal regulation as well. But we're talking about the federal regulation here. But it has to have been registered. You have to have an operating handbook. We call that the POH, the Pilot's Operating Handbook. That's got all the information about that particular aircraft. We'll talk more about that in class as well because there's a little thing that I want you to know about that as well. And aircraft weight and balance data. We have to know those as well. So those are the 4 things you have to know. So make sure you have those written down in your notes, and we'll talk more about those in class. We'll talk more about those in class. All right, accident reporting. Now, this is a different part of the regulations. Look, it's 830, and that's because there's something called the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. They're not the FAA. They're not governed by the FAA. They're under the Department of Transportation, but they're a different thing than the FAA, and they have their own regulations, and the regulations that we need to know are usually in this 830 range here. So we're going to talk about 830.05 and 830.15. This is about accident reporting. It's something you have to know as a pilot in command. And things that require immediate notification to the National Transportation Safety Board, to the NTSB, is this. Anytime you have a flight control system malfunction or failure, so if you're flying along and your flight controls fail, your yoke fails, you need to report that immediately. And I'm just going to go ahead and blow through these and we'll talk about them in class. Any flight crew member to perform the flight duties as a result of injury or illness. So somebody in your flight crew gets sick. That includes flight attendants on airliners. Failure of any internal turbine engine component. We don't fly turbine engines typically as private pilots, but you have to report that if you are. If you have an in-flight fire, that's every aircraft. Something catches on fire, you have to report that. Aircraft collision in flight. So if you collide with another airplane in flight, you have to report that. Damage to property other than the aircraft that is estimated to exceed $25,000 for repair, or the fair market value in the event of a total loss, whichever is less. So basically, if something costs $25,000 to replace, or you total it out at greater than that, you need to report that as well. Release of all or a portion of a propeller blade from an aircraft, excluding if you hit something on the ground. So if you're taxiing around and accidentally run into like a sign or something, they're not talking about that. They're usually talking about if it just flies off on its own, you didn't collide with anything on the ground, or if you're in flight. Make sure you have those written down. So you must report any accident. So what's an accident? That's what it says. It says you must report any accident in 830.15. So here's what it says an aircraft accident is. This is when a person suffers death or injury, serious injury, in which the aircraft receives substantial damage between getting into and out of an aircraft with the intention to fly. So if somebody's getting in and out of your plane and you are intending to take off and it's a serious injury or they die, you have to report that immediately. Now, my question would be, all right, well, it's a serious injury. Like they get poked in the eye. Is that serious? They break a bone. Is that serious? They get a bad cut. Is that serious? They had to go to the hospital. The ambulance had to come. Is that serious? Like, how do you know what's serious or what's not? Well, they actually define that as well. What is a serious injury? Serious injury requires hospitalization for more than 48 hours. So if they're in the hospital for 24 hours, not necessarily, may not count. Results in the fracture of any bone except simple fractures of the fingers, toes, or nose. So fingers, toes, and nose apparently don't count. So you drop something on somebody's toe and it breaks. We're not talking about that. Causes severe hemorrhages, nerve, muscle, or tendon damage. That would be something you want to ask the doctor. Like, is this severe hemorrhage or is this a minor hemorrhage? Involves any internal organ. So you have an injury to an internal organ like the liver, lungs, heart, anything like that. Involves second or third degree burns, or any burns affecting more than 5% of the body surface. So they have 100% of the body surface, and you can measure that in like square inches. If 5% of the body got burned badly, that's a serious injury. Make sure you have those written down. All right, so how soon? When do I have to report the accident? Well, civil or public or foreign aircraft shall report it within 10 days after the accident or after 7 days if an overdue aircraft is still missing. So if something's overdue, somebody went flying like, hey, I'm going fishing up in Canada and nobody's heard from them in 7 days, but they left from the United States, you should probably report that if it's overdue. All right, next section we're talking about is medical certificates. This is kind of the other side of the pilot's license. So you can go get a pilot's license, and the pilot's license technically doesn't expire. You got to get that BFR. You got to stay current with it. But technically, my license doesn't have an expiration date on it. But your medical certificate does, and most licenses require medical certificates of some kind. Most pilots need a medical certificate. There are exceptions. So we're going to focus on the main three types, though, that are on the test, on the written test. Number one, we're talking about first class, then we're talking about second class, and we're talking about third class. Now, what I want you to know about each of these is that, and we'll talk more about this in class, but each of these is your privileges of your license are really dependent upon your medical certificate. If you have certain medical certificates, you can do certain things. And if your medical certificate expires or it gets a little old, it gets downgraded sometimes into other privileges and limitations as well. So just kind of keep that in mind, that your medical certificate is, well, what are you going to do with your license? It doesn't mean you lose your license just because you go from a first class to a second class or whatever. So pay attention to kind of how long they last. First of all, if you're over the age of 40, a first class medical lasts 6 months, which is, that's just kind of a funny way to say that. I'm going to say 6 months. And if you're under 40, it's the 12th month after the month of the examination is when it expires. So it's supposed to be 6 months after the month of the date of it expires there. I'm going to be fighting with that every slide, I think. Then, It's only good for 12 months if you're a second class medical, and then it drops to a third class for another 12 months. So if you get a second class medical, it's good for 12 months to be used as a second class, and then it drops to there. And then third class, this is what private pilots are required to have at a minimum. You can have some of these other ones too. If you're 40, over the age of 40, it's the 24 month after the month of the date of examination. So it's good for 22 years. It's good for 2 years, not 22 years. And it is it's a calendar months. It's calendar months. So if you're over the age of 40, if you're not over the age of 40, which most of you are not, of course, it's the 60th month. So it's good for 5 years after that. So if you go get a third class medical for your training, to get your training done, you could probably get through most of your training with just one third class medical if you're under the age of 40, unless you stretch it out past 5 years. So this is what they're good for. Airline pilots need a first class medical. So if you're operating on an ATP certificate, that airline transport pilot certificate, you need to have a first class medical. Second class medical is all of the commercial pilots. So if you're doing like banner towing or aerial surveying, sightseeing, those kinds of things, you're getting paid to fly, you need to have at least a second class medical. First class will work as well, but you got to have at least a second class medical. And then third class is typically for private pilots and flight instructors. So those of us giving flight instruction, even though I'm getting paid to get flight instruction, technically I'm not a pilot, I'm an instructor. And that's a whole messy thing that we don't need to talk about today. But you should know that flight instructors and private pilots should have at least a third class medical in order to go out and exercise the privileges and limitations of their license. Alrighty, that is the end of this lesson. Thanks for hanging in there. Hopefully get your notes done. Make sure to bring them to class. Thanks.